In 2016, a wealthy buyer walked into a Ferrari dealership with the ability to pay full price in cash for the car he wanted. No financing, no negotiation, no haggling over the number. And Ferrari said no. Not because the car wasn't available, not because his credit was bad, since there was no credit involved at all. He was told, politely, that he hadn't yet been approved to purchase that particular model because he didn't have the right relationship with the brand, hadn't bought the right cars before it, hadn't been a client long enough, hadn't demonstrated whatever internal criteria Ferrari uses to decide who gets access. This wasn't an isolated story. It happens constantly, quietly, to buyers all over the world who have more than enough money and are still turned away. Here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. Ferrari is a publicly traded company with a legal obligation to shareholders to maximize profit. And one of the most consistent ways it fulfills that obligation is by refusing to sell cars to people who are trying to buy them. Once you understand why that refusal is not a contradiction, but the entire point, you will never look at a supercar dealership the same way again. I'm going to tell you why Ferrari won't sell a car to just anyone. And I promise you the real answer is one of the most deliberate, most mathematically precise business strategies in all of luxury manufacturing. Here's what's ahead. I'm going to walk you through the actual production philosophy Enzo Ferrari himself built the company around, a single sentence that still governs how many cars roll off the line today. We'll break down the invisible scoring system, sometimes called the Ferrari points program by insiders, that determines who's even allowed to be offered the company's most desirable models. I'll show you the legal mechanism buried in almost every Ferrari purchase contract that lets the company punish you for reselling too quickly, and why that clause exists to protect something worth more to Ferrari than any single sale. And by the end, you'll understand why turning down your money isn't Ferrari failing to run a business efficiently. It's Ferrari running the business more efficiently than almost any other manufacturer on the planet, just by a completely different set of rules than the ones you assumed applied. Think of Ferrari's production line not as a factory trying to build as many cars as it can sell, which is how virtually every other car company on earth operates, but as a faucet deliberately turned to roughly 3/4 open, forever, regardless of how loudly the world is asking for more water. Toyota wants to sell you a Camry. Ford wants to sell you an F-150. Every incentive inside those companies, every quarterly earnings call, every factory expansion is built around a single question. How do we make and sell more units? Ferrari inverted that question decades ago and never inverted it back. The question inside Ferrari isn't how many cars can we sell. It's how few cars can we build while still growing revenue. And that single inversion is the root of every strange, seemingly customer hostile decision the company makes, because it isn't customer hostile at all once you understand what it's actually optimizing for. This philosophy didn't come from a modern marketing department trying to manufacture hype, and it's worth knowing where it actually started. It came directly from Enzo Ferrari, the company's founder, who is widely quoted across decades of interviews and company lore with some version of a single guiding principle that Ferrari should always produce one fewer car than the market demands, not roughly enough cars, not slightly fewer than optimal, deliberately, permanently short of demand, forever, as a founding law of how the business would operate. This wasn't framed as a customer service failure Enzo Ferrari was apologizing for. It was framed explicitly as the mechanism that would keep every Ferrari valuable, keep every owner feeling like they belong to something exclusive, and keep the brand's mystique intact across generations long after Enzo himself was gone. And it worked so completely that it survived his death, survived the company going public in 2015, survived multiple changes in CEO and ownership structure, and remains, to this day, the explicit production philosophy the modern company describes in its own investor communications, where executives have openly told analysts and shareholders that maintaining scarcity, not maximizing volume, is the primary lever protecting the brand's extraordinary margins. Here's the number that makes this concrete. Ferrari produces somewhere in the range of 13,000 to 14,000 cars a year globally. For comparison, a single popular truck model from a mainstream manufacturer can sell that many units in the United States alone within a matter of weeks. Ferrari has the manufacturing capability, the brand recognition, and by every account, the raw consumer demand to build and sell significantly more cars than it currently does, and has for years. It simply chooses not to, as a matter of explicit, board-approved strategy, because the company has run the numbers repeatedly across decades, and found that expanding production would very likely increase total units sold in the short term while permanently damaging the resale values, the waiting list mystique, and the brand equity that let Ferrari charge some of the highest margins in the entire automotive industry, luxury or otherwise. Ferrari's own reported operating margins have consistently run well above 20%, a figure that would be considered extraordinary anywhere in mainstream car manufacturing, where single-digit margins are common and even luxury brands rarely approach what Ferrari sustains year after year. That margin isn't primarily explained by superior engineering costs relative to competitors. It's explained by a deliberately undersupplied market that lets Ferrari set prices and increasingly choose its own customers, largely free of the competitive pressure that would exist if the company simply built enough cars to satisfy everyone who wanted one. How that scarcity philosophy actually gets enforced on the ground is where this gets interesting, because sell fewer cars than people want is easy to say as a slogan and genuinely complicated to operate as a business, and Ferrari has built an entire invisible infrastructure to manage exactly that complexity. This is where the story moves from theory into something buyers actually experience, and it starts with what's informally known inside the Ferrari collector world as the points system, sometimes called the allocation program. Ferrari does not sell its most desirable, most limited models, the specialty and limited series cars that sit at the top of the lineup, on a simple first come, first served basis, or even purely on ability to pay. Instead, dealers and the company track a client's history, how many Ferraris you already own, how long you've owned the brand, what models you've purchased previously, whether you've participated in Ferrari branded events and racing programs, and even, according to reporting from inside the dealer network, whether you've been a well-behaved client who hasn't caused problems or flipped previous purchases for a quick profit. All of that history gets rolled into an informal, sometimes semi-formal scoring system that determines whether you're even offered the chance to buy the newest limited model before it goes on sale. Being a first-time buyer with essentially unlimited cash is, by multiple documented accounts from collectors and industry journalists, frequently not enough on its own to access the most exclusive cars. You often have to buy your way into the relationship first, sometimes over years, purchasing several more accessible Ferrari models, building a track record with the brand, before you're ever offered a chance at the car you actually wanted from the beginning. Let me give you a short scene to make this concrete, close to how collectors and dealers have described these conversations happening in real life. A buyer walks into a dealership with the funds ready for a limited production model everyone's heard about. One of the ultra-rare specials Ferrari releases every few years in quantities, sometimes numbering only in the hundreds worldwide. The salesperson doesn't say no outright. The salesperson says something closer to, "This allocation is extremely limited," and Maranello makes the final decision on who receives one, based on the client's history with the marque. Translated out of the polite language, that means you haven't earned this yet. No matter how much money is sitting in your account right now, the buyer, if he wants any real chance at that car, or the next one, or the one after that, understands the unspoken instruction embedded in that sentence. Go buy 2 or 3 more accessible Ferraris first, show up to the company's driving events, build a relationship with this specific dealership. Prove over years that you're the kind of owner Ferrari wants associated with its most exclusive tier, not simply the kind of buyer with a large enough bank account. This isn't a story about one rude salesperson. It's a documented, structural way the entire allocation system for Ferrari's rarest cars operates. And it's precisely why so many wealthy first-time supercar buyers, people who could easily write a check for any car on earth, describe being genuinely stunned the first time they discover that money alone doesn't automatically open Ferrari's front door. Here's the psychological mechanism underneath all of this. And it's the same one that shows up in every corner of manufactured scarcity. But Ferrari runs it with more precision and more financial discipline than almost any other brand on earth. There's a well-established finding in behavioral economics that scarcity doesn't just fail to reduce demand for certain goods, it actively increases it, a pattern economists trace back to the work of Thorstein Veblen, who studied what he called conspicuous consumption, goods whose value comes partly, sometimes primarily, from the difficulty and cost of obtaining them rather than from their raw material or functional utility. A Ferrari built to identical mechanical specifications, but sold freely, with no waiting list, no allocation requirement, available to literally anyone who walked in with the purchase price, would be, from a pure engineering standpoint, the exact same car. It would not be worth the same amount because a meaningful part of what a buyer is purchasing isn't the car itself. It's provable access to something most people, even most wealthy people, cannot simply buy on demand. And that provable scarcity is inseparable from the price the market is willing to pay, both at the dealership and years later in the resale market. The resale market is where Ferrari's strategy reveals its most sophisticated layer and where the company goes further than almost any other manufacturer to protect its own scarcity from being undermined by its own customers. Buried in the purchase contracts for many of Ferrari's most limited models is a clause, widely reported across automotive and legal press coverage, that grants Ferrari a right of first refusal, and in some documented cases an outright resale restriction, preventing an owner from selling the car on the open market for a specified period, sometimes a year or more, without first offering it back to Ferrari, or at minimum getting the company's approval for the sale. Some contracts have gone further still, with reported cases of Ferrari effectively blacklisting clients from future allocations after they were found to have quickly flipped a limited edition car for a significant profit, treating the flip itself as a breach of the unwritten relationship the buyer was supposed to be building with the brand, even when no explicit contractual line was technically crossed. From a pure legal standpoint, some of these restrictions exist in a genuinely gray area and have occasionally been challenged, but the practical effect has been well documented. A chilling effect strong enough that most serious Ferrari collectors simply don't test the boundary, because losing future access to the brand's most desirable allocations is a far larger financial and reputational cost than whatever quick profit a fast resale might generate. Why would a company care this much about what happens to a car after it's already been paid for? This is the question that unlocks the entire strategy, and the answer comes down to a single asset Ferrari protects more carefully than almost anything else it owns: its residual value. Unlike almost every other car on Earth, which begins losing value the moment it's driven off the lot, limited production Ferraris have a well-documented history of holding their value remarkably well, and in the case of the rarest models, frequently appreciating significantly above their original purchase price within just a few years. Multiple limited Ferrari models released over the past 2 decades have been documented reselling, sometimes within a year or two of original delivery, at prices 50%, in some notable cases well over 100%, above what the original buyer paid, despite the car being on paper a rapidly depreciating consumer good. That appreciation isn't an accident of the used car market. It's the direct, intended output of the exact scarcity mechanism we've been describing, because a rapid, uncontrolled flood of resales, especially at prices below what Ferrari's carefully managed allocation system implies the car should be worth, would send a signal to the entire market that these cars aren't actually as scarce or as desirable as the waiting list suggested, undermining the mystique that lets Ferrari charge premium prices on every subsequent limited release. Ferrari isn't just protecting its own retail sales when it restricts resale. It's protecting the entire pricing structure of every Ferrari that will ever be sold in the future, because that structure depends entirely on buyers believing, correctly, that these cars are difficult to obtain and unlikely to flood the market. There's a specific historical episode worth knowing here, because it shows what happens when this exact protection mechanism briefly fails, and it involves one of Ferrari's most famous modern limited models. In the years following its release, a wave of early buyers, some of whom appeared to have secured allocations more through dealer relationships or flipped ownership than genuine long-term brand loyalty, immediately listed their cars for resale at enormous markups, in some reported cases within weeks of taking delivery. Ferrari's response was swift and became something of an industry case study, with the company reportedly identifying certain flippers and effectively closing the door on any future allocation for them, in some accounts extending that consequence to the dealership that had approved the original sale. Automotive journalists covering the episode described it as Ferrari sending an unmistakable message to its entire dealer network and client base simultaneously that access to future scarce models was conditional on protecting the very scarcity mechanism that made those models valuable in the first place, and that violating the spirit of that arrangement, even without technically breaking a contract clause, carried a real and lasting cost. The episode is frequently cited by collectors as the clearest possible proof that the point system and resale expectations aren't informal suggestions politely offered by a salesperson. They are enforced consistently at the highest levels of the company, because the alternative is watching the entire scarcity-driven pricing structure quietly erode from the inside. Comparing this to how other supercar manufacturers handle the same underlying pressure makes Ferrari's discipline stand out even more clearly. Lamborghini, a genuine rival in the same price and performance category, has historically run production numbers noticeably higher than Ferrari's relative to its overall lineup, and has been more willing, at various points in its history, to expand output in response to strong demand. Lamborghini has produced excellent, highly desirable cars for decades, but the brand's resale value trajectory and overall market mystique have generally not matched Ferrari's with the same consistency, something that automotive analysts and collectors have repeatedly connected directly back to Ferrari's more disciplined, more restrictive approach to both production volume and buyer allocation. McLaren, a newer entrant into the ultra high-end segment, went even further in the opposite direction during parts of its history, expanding production more aggressively in pursuit of growth, and has, at multiple points, faced noticeably softer resale values on several models compared to equivalent Ferraris, along with periods of real financial strain that led to structural changes within the company. None of this means Lamborghini or McLaren build worse cars. In many enthusiast circles, the engineering conversation is close, sometimes tilted in a rival's favor on pure performance metrics. What separates Ferrari isn't necessarily the car. It's the multi-decade discipline of treating undersupply as a permanent, foundational business strategy rather than a temporary response to unusually high demand, and refusing to abandon that discipline, even when abandoning it would have generated more short-term revenue. Porsche offers a particularly instructive middle case because the company runs two almost entirely different scarcity strategies simultaneously, depending on which part of its lineup you're looking at. The standard 911 lineup is produced in large enough volumes, tens of thousands of units annually, that ordinary market dynamics apply, with dealers competing on price and availability in a way that would be unrecognizable inside a Ferrari showroom. But Porsche's limited GT division models, the specialized track-oriented variants released periodically in restricted numbers, are allocated through a system remarkably similar to Ferrari's, prioritizing existing loyal owners, dealership relationship history, and even documented track usage of prior Porsche models over simple ability to pay. Porsche executives have been candid in interviews about deliberately running two different playbooks under one badge: mass market discipline for the volume models funding the company's broader business, and manufactured scarcity discipline for the halo models protecting the brand's performance mystique and feeding resale values that regularly see limited GT models trade for significantly above their original sticker price within months of delivery. Porsche essentially proves the mechanism works as a selectable strategy, not just an inherited company culture, because the same organization runs both models at once, choosing scarcity specifically where scarcity generates the most brand value, and choosing volume everywhere else. There's a broader economic concept worth naming here, because it explains why this strategy is so much rarer than you'd expect, given how well it clearly works. Economists sometimes describe this as leaving money on the table on purpose, a phrase that sounds irrational until you understand the trade-off being made. Every single year that Ferrari chooses not to expand production to meet full market demand, it is mathematically foregoing revenue it could capture immediately, revenue that would show up as a larger number on that year's income statement, that would please shareholders looking purely at short-term growth, and that competitors chasing pure volume would happily capture in Ferrari's place if given the chance. Ferrari's board has, by every public account, consistently chosen the smaller number today in exchange for a larger number and a more durable brand across every future year, a bet that only pays off if the discipline holds for decades without wavering, because a single year of chasing volume, of quietly loosening the allocation system to capture more short-term sales, risks unwinding the scarcity perception that took generations to build. This is precisely why so few companies successfully run this playbook. It requires resisting one of the strongest, most universal pressures in modern business: the pressure to say yes to a customer standing in front of you with money in hand. And Ferrari has built its entire century-long identity around being one of the only companies with the institutional discipline to consistently say no. There's a psychological layer underneath all of this worth naming directly, because it explains why the system produces not just compliant buyers, but genuinely enthusiastic ones. There's a well-documented finding in behavioral economics called effort justification, first demonstrated in classic experiments showing that people who had to go through a difficult or uncomfortable process to gain access to something ended up valuing that thing significantly more than people who received the identical item with no barrier at all. A Ferrari buyer who spent 3 years building a relationship with a dealership, purchasing 2 more accessible models along the way, attending company events before finally being offered the car they originally wanted, doesn't experience that car as a purchase they were forced to earn. They experience it as a purchase they earned, a subtle but critical difference. And that earned feeling produces a level of brand loyalty and emotional attachment that a simple, frictionless transaction could never generate. Ferrari isn't just selling cars more slowly than demand would allow, it's converting the weight itself into a psychological asset that makes every eventual buyer a more devoted, more emotionally invested client than they would have been if the company had simply said yes on day one. There's a real cost and a real protection worth naming here, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is a purely cynical trick with no substance behind it. There is a genuine, defensible argument made consistently by Ferrari's own leadership over the decades that maintaining smaller production runs allows for meaningfully higher quality control, more hands-on craftsmanship per vehicle, and a level of engineering attention that would be structurally difficult to maintain at dramatically higher volumes. Some of the scarcity is genuinely tied to real production constraints, specialized components, hand-finished interior work, and testing processes that don't scale linearly the way mass-market manufacturing does. But here's the distinction worth holding on to. The same distinction that matters across every version of manufacturer scarcity we've discussed. Genuine scarcity comes from a real constraint outside the company's control. Manufactured scarcity is a business decision, reversible in principle, chosen because the resulting exclusivity generates more total value than meeting full demand would. Ferrari's own leadership has been remarkably candid across investor calls and interviews over the years that the production ceiling is set well below what the company's actual manufacturing capability and demand would support, explicitly framing it as a deliberate brand protection strategy rather than a hard technical limit. The craftsmanship argument is real. It simply isn't the whole story, and Ferrari's own executives have said as much on the record more than once. Here's the part of this that extends far beyond cars, and it's worth understanding even if you have no interest in ever owning a Ferrari yourself, because the underlying pattern shows up across nearly every category of goods where price and access, rather than function, drive the majority of perceived value. Limited edition sneaker releases run a smaller, faster version of the same allocation logic, restricting supply and sometimes requiring a purchase history or loyalty program status before a customer is even eligible to buy the most sought-after drops. High-end handbag houses run nearly identical waitlist and relationship-building systems before offering their rarest models to clients, prioritizing existing customers with strong purchase histories over new buyers regardless of ability to pay. Even certain real estate developments in ultra-competitive markets have adopted informal buyer vetting processes for the most desirable units, prioritizing certain buyers over others based on factors beyond pure financial qualification. Once you've seen the Ferrari version of this clearly, the underlying mechanism, deliberate undersupply, relationship-gated access, and resale restriction protecting resale value becomes recognizable everywhere, because it is, at its core, one of the most reliable value preservation strategies available to any company selling a good whose price is driven substantially by status and scarcity rather than by raw material or functional cost. So, what do you actually do with this information? Because understanding Ferrari's strategy is interesting even if you'll never personally be in a position to buy one of these cars, and the lesson generalizes further than you might expect. First, recognize the difference between genuine scarcity and manufactured scarcity in any purchase decision you're facing at any price point, because the psychological pull is identical whether it's a car costing hundreds of thousands of dollars or a sneaker costing $200. Ask directly whether the seller could meet demand and is choosing not to, versus whether a real external constraint is limiting supply, because that answer changes how much weight the scarcity itself deserves in your decision, separate from your actual assessment of the underlying product. Second, understand that in any category where manufactured scarcity operates, the waiting, the vetting, the relationship building requirement isn't an obstacle the seller is failing to remove. It's the product, working exactly as designed, and recognizing that upfront can save you from interpreting a rejection or a long wait as a personal failing rather than what it actually is, a deliberate business mechanism that would function identically regardless of who was standing in line. Third, if you're a business owner or a founder rather than simply a consumer navigating these systems from the outside, there's a genuinely applicable lesson buried in Ferrari's example, even at a scale nowhere near a supercar manufacturer's. Chasing every available sale is not automatically the strategy that builds the most durable, most valuable business over the long run, and there are real, well-documented cases across far more accessible price points. Small design studios, limited-run consumer goods brands, boutique service businesses, where deliberately capping capacity or client volume, turning away work that would technically fit the calendar, has produced stronger pricing power and better long-term client relationships than saying yes to everyone who could pay. The scale is different. The underlying discipline, choosing a smaller number today in exchange for a more durable, more valuable position tomorrow, is exactly the same lesson Enzo Ferrari built an entire company around nearly a century ago. Fourth, if you're ever evaluating an investment or a collectible specifically because of its resale value potential, understand that manufactured scarcity strategies like Ferrari's only continue working as long as the company maintains a discipline to keep them, and that discipline has, historically, occasionally broken down at other brands, sometimes quietly, when short-term financial pressure won out over long-term brand protection, which is a real risk worth weighing rather than assuming any scarcity-driven value is permanent simply because it's held for decades so far. Here's the identity level point I want you to leave with. Ferrari turning down a guaranteed sale isn't the company failing at basic business sense. It's one of the most disciplined, most consistently executed pricing strategies in the history of manufacturing, built on a single sentence from a founder who understood nearly a century ago that the value of what you're selling can be inseparable from how hard it is to get, and that a company willing to accept a smaller number today, permanently, can end up with a far larger number and a far more durable business than a company chasing every sale in front of it. The waiting list, the allocation scoring, the resale restrictions, none of it is an accident, and none of it is really about you as an individual buyer at all. It's about protecting a mathematical relationship between scarcity and price that took a century to build, and that Ferrari has, so far, refused to trade away for a single additional car sold this quarter. Here are your 3 takeaways. 1. Ferrari's entire production philosophy traces back to a single, explicit strategic decision to permanently build fewer cars than the market demands, a choice the company's own leadership has openly described on the record as a deliberate brand protection strategy rather than a hard manufacturing constraint. 2. Access to Ferrari's most desirable cars is gated by an informal but very real scoring system based on purchase history and relationship with the brand, meaning money alone, even a guaranteed cash sale, is frequently not sufficient to buy the car you want because Ferrari is optimizing for long-term brand equity and resale value protection, not simply for closing the transaction in front of it. 3. This same underlying mechanism, manufactured scarcity, relationship-gated access, and resale restriction protecting long-term value, shows up across luxury goods, collectibles, and even real estate far beyond the automotive world. And recognizing the pattern rather than the specific brand running it is what actually protects you from mistaking a deliberate business strategy for a personal compliment or a personal rejection. The next time you hear about someone with unlimited money getting turned away from buying a car, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Not a company that doesn't want your business, a company that has run the numbers for nearly a century and decided deliberately every single year that saying no to you today is worth more than saying yes, because the entire value of every Ferrari that will ever be sold depends on that no remaining credible. If this changed the way you'll look at the next waiting list you run into, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.